All right, welcome back to the guest room studio. I had done a few things with the nut of the guitar since my last video, and then I've been away from the project for a few days, so I wanted to get in and do a quick, hopefully a short catch-up video about where I'm at right now. The big news is the neck is back on and the guitar is strung, and I've started working the nut. And where I have it right now is just playable and with no electronics. This thing sounds great unplugged. It's snappy, it's full, it has sustain. So I really think that I'm doing the right thing with this. I think it's going the right direction. If you hear any background noise, my kids are making some noise. Sorry about that. There's also, I think the kid across the road got a new dirt bike. So let's see what happens. So let's see. I went ahead and glued and clamped the nut in that I'd shaped down. I cut it rough with a hacksaw, and then I put a piece of sandpaper on a flat surface, and I was rubbing it down to get it down to thickness and height. Once I had it glued in, it was looking really good. I used a little bit of Elmer's, and I clamped it for a while. I usually use string tension to clamp it in, but since I didn't have the slots started at all, I wanted to go ahead and just clamp it down, clamped it overnight. And so then what I did was, it was still too high. It was high enough that I didn't want to lay out the frets there, so just quickly, here's what I did. I stacked a couple of feeler gauges until I found out how tall these frets are down here. And then I put the feeler gauges, that same stack, and it was maybe a stack plus a little bit more, I forget exactly, plus the thickness of a pencil. Because what I did was I held that down onto the nut, took a nice sharp pencil, and drew across. It was slightly radiused, but not much. Drew across, and so that's the lowest you'd want to go. I took the Dremel with a little sandpaper wheel on it, and I took the nut down roughly just above. I could still see my pencil mark. And then I went across with a flat file, and I flattened the thing off so it was not radiused. But it was flattened down to where I knew it was ready to put the slots in, and I wouldn't be cutting the slots any deeper than necessary. I still kept the shoulders all nice and square, so it's all rectangular. And then I take a really fine ruler. And by the way, when I use these rulers, I don't measure from the end of the ruler. You know, if I need to measure 20 millimeters, I measure from 10 to 30. I don't trust the corner. Have you ever noticed that rulers almost never start at 0? The reason why is these corners will get, buggered and worn out, and then you won't have a true 0. So when I'm doing really fine measurements, I always start at like 10 millimeters, or I start at 1 inch. I take my measurements off of there. You got to watch you don't goof it, but it's better, I think, and it's more consistent. And like I said, if you caught my video about all the calculations for the slot distances, I measure it once from the bass to the treble and lay it all out. I turn it around, treble back to bass. It was really, really in good shape. Everything's really good. So it's all rectangular, and that's in. Then I started cutting the slots with a very fine triangular file. The profile of the triangular file is not skinny enough to do the unwound strings, and it's too much of a V to properly do the wound strings. So this is just a nice way to start the slots really precisely, and if I start it off at all, what I can do is keep the file straight up and down with the triangular part pointing down, but put a little pressure to one side or the other to work it back in. Luckily this go around, I got it started right on the spots I wanted, got them taken down a little bit. So that's all I've done is I've used this file. I probably went a little further with it than I should have, because what I do then is I finish the slots themselves, the finished slots. I don't use a nut slotting file. They're expensive. I'm sure they would do a great job, but they're expensive. I heard people using these torch tip cleaners. I tried that. It's not worth it. I mean, the torch tip cleaners, they cost $5, but it's not worth it. They don't do a good job, I don't think. Maybe in plastic, but bone is way too hard. They just bend. They're not precise. They're no good. What I would do for the bass strings was no problem. I would fold my sandpaper in half, whatever I'm using, you know, 220, 320, fold it in half, measure the thickness with this, and then add on feeler gauges till I had whatever I needed. And I'm always going to slot the nut 1/100th or two bigger than the strings. So if I'm planning on using, you know, a set that goes like 11 to 49, I think was my heavier set. So I'm aiming for like 51 or 52 thousandths of an inch. So sandpaper plus feeler gauges, and I can stack a couple of these on top of each other. There's different combinations. If you don't know about these, you'll buy a set of these. They're great for doing certain fine measurements. And I'd use that on the E string, and I'd figure out which one to use on the A string, and so on. So I'm really careful about always, the slots want to be maybe a 100th or two bigger than the strings you intend to use. If you're planning on swapping between 9s and 10s, lay it out for 10s, you know. Make the small string an 11 slot, and then you know you can do 9s or 10s, no problem. But for those unwound strings, the thickness of the sandpaper is already too thick. And if you try to put a feeler gauge for like the G string, it's such a flimsy feeler, it doesn't work the right way. So for the unwound strings, here's something I finally figured out. Again, no torch tip cleaners, no expensive files. I found the right size feeler gauges, and I put 50 grit on my belt sander, and I run one edge of the feeler gauge on the belt sander really carefully, really evenly, and I'll profile it and round it a little bit. And so what I have here is a 11 thousandths that's been turned into a little bit of a file. I have a 18 thousandths. I mean, there's just a little bit of roughness there. It's not much, but it'll cut into the bone a little bit. You have to be patient, but it'll work. And then I have a 14 thousandths. So that's my usual EBG that I'll use. And again, if I feel like, I'd like it to be just a little bit more relieved, then I'll just do a little bit of an angle there a little bit. Then I can address the back side of the nut slot and everything else I need to. So I got the feeler gauges that are roughened on the edge. I think it works really well. And it costs almost nothing. I mean, it's stuff I had sitting around, and they still work as feeler gauges across all the rest of them. So that gets those slots started. So what I have right now is they're cut down just with the V of the file. I'm going to finish them down. While I'm talking about the nut depth and all, I should mention, here's how I know how deep to go. When I first did this, I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I mean, maybe you laugh. My first guitar I ever did this on, I used a hacksaw blade for all 6 strings. And it was ridiculously too wide for the E string. And I played it like that for a while, until I went back at it and I put a new one on and used a triangular file. And it still wasn't really... But anyway, we've learned since then. So here's what you want to do. I'll see if we can see here. What's going to happen is you're going to be taking those nut slots down, 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 and I'll talk about the E string maybe. This is not going to come across super clear on the camera, but I'll see what I can do to get a pretty decent view of it. What you want to do is fret that string between the 2nd and 3rd fret, where the dot would be, and then you're going to tap up here. And you'll just hear a little bit of ringing. If you hear a little bit of ringing, you know you have clearance. You can also, if your eyes are good and you have good light, you can look in and see that tiny bit of movement. I mean, you're talking about from here to there, though, just enough of clearance for light to pass under, like just enough that you can see movement. You don't want to see the string bending. You just want to see if the string just moves the tiniest bit. Or if you tap it, you just hear a little tap on there. So tiny amounts, because you're talking about roughly like the thickness of a piece of paper if you're fretted here. There's other ways to do this, but I still don't have the action set, I don't have the relief set or anything else, so I don't trust anything else. This is the best way to get the nut. Once the nut is done, then you check the relief. It's been strung up, so it's time to check the relief anytime now. Nut, relief, then bridge check the action, then intonation, and then double check everything. But that's how I'll know how deep to go. And so I'll check that on each string. I'll get my little thing out. I'll just loosen the string, pick it up and put it to the side a little bit and file, 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 put it back on and check the depth. Take it off, file, file, file. You really don't want to go too deep, so once it gets close, you want to be careful and you want to watch out that you're putting that back profile in there a little bit. But I'll do all that real carefully. And then the next time I string the guitar up, once the strings are off, the next time I do it, then I'll round off the shoulders of the nut. I'll contour. I'll make the nut all comfy then, so there's no sharp, hard corners to it. Maybe polish it just a little bit on the outside. But that's the last thing to get it playable up here. That's what that needs. A little bit of graphite in there maybe when I start playing, but it's great already. It really plays nice. The frets are smaller than I like, but it is playing super nice. There's some other updates I need to be getting into, but that's the main thing for what's happening up here. While I'm talking about feeler gauges, I mean, a thickness of paper I think is like a couple thousandths, 2-3 thousandths, maybe 4 thousandths. If you have a decent set of feeler gauges, you have a 2 thousandths feeler gauge in there, and so you can also fret that here and see how sloppy is like a 2 or a 3 thou feeler gauge. If you slip it in there and you can see that the feeler gauge still has clearance, you know you can file down a little bit. I try to keep track of my filing, like, oh, 5 file strokes, can I tell a difference? No, okay, 10 file strokes, does that make, okay, that makes a difference. You want to be careful. You want to watch what kind of sandpaper you're using in there. If I start off with like a 220, it's going to remove stuff relatively quickly. I'll see dust forming fast. I got to be careful of that. But I'll probably try to finish those slots with more like a 320 or something that's going to polish the slot a little bit. So one of the big things about bone, it's hard enough that it does polish up slightly. You know, it's got a lot of advantages over plastic, but one of the things that it really has in its favor is it will polish slightly, and it'll take graphite then in the slot itself that'll make it really nice. You know, you can put graphite in plastic, but they're soft. They're not going to polish nicely and take that hard surface the way a bone will. So I wanted this to be a quick update. I should stop there and get going for now. There's some other updates going on with electronics and all, but that's a different matter. I wanted to talk about the neck and the fact that this guy's all strung up. So that's going to be about it for right now. The questions for me about the feeler gauges, anything like that, you know, check with me, whatever. I guess it's probably also the point, I should say this series is about half over at this point. If you've been checking out my other videos, you know, like, comment, subscribe. If you contact me, if you have questions about how I'm doing what I'm doing, I'll try to respond. You know, you need to have a little bit of that, you know, use a little bit of common sense and use your judgment there. If you're tearing a guitar apart, what does it really need and what are you going to do to it? But I hope that this is going to be beneficial and give some people some good ideas of things they can do. Again, big improvements in playability, I think, for not a lot of money. And already I can tell the way this thing's, I mean, it's not going to come across very well here, but it sounds good unplugged. So to me, that's always a step in the right direction. If a guitar does not sound good unplugged, then all the electrics are doing is trying to fix the shortcomings. But this thing sounds nice unplugged. So I like that. Let's see. Next episode is probably talking about some soldering and the controls and some choices I'm making there. And then we're getting near the end of all this. So that's it for now. Have a good night. Take care.